The plate was still full when Calvin Stone pushed back from the table. He had not meant to notice. He was a man who prided himself on minding his own affairs, on keeping his eyes fixed on the horizon where the cattle grazed, and the grass rolled in golden waves across the Texas Panhandle. He had built Stone Creek Ranch with his own 2 hands over 14 years, and those hands had taught him that looking too hard at things that were not his business only brought heartache. But he noticed. Lavinia Kendrick had not touched her supper, not a single bite. She had set the plate in front of the 2 children first, portioning out the roasted chicken and the boiled potatoes with careful, deliberate hands, making sure the older boy got the larger piece of bread, making sure the little girl had enough gravy to suit her. Then Lavinia had sat down at the far end of the long pine table in Calvin's kitchen, and she had placed her own plate before her, and she had spent the entire meal watching the children eat with an expression on her face that was equal parts love and something much more desperate. Something that looked like sacrifice made so many times it had become invisible even to the one making it. When the children finished and scraped their plates, she had quietly served them the remainder of what had been on her own plate, telling them it was extra, telling them she had already eaten while she cooked, and the lie was so smooth and so practiced that both children had believed it without question. Calvin had not. He had watched from the doorway of the kitchen, where he had come to refill his coffee cup after tending to the horses, and he had seen the whole quiet transaction. He had seen her hands tremble slightly as she spooned the last of the chicken onto young Thomas's plate. He had seen the hollow curve of her cheek when she turned in profile, the way her dress hung a fraction too loose at the shoulders even though she had clearly mended it to fit as best she could. He had seen the truth written in every careful, selfless gesture, and it had hit him somewhere behind the sternum with the force of a physical blow. She was going hungry so those children could eat, and judging by the practiced ease of it, she had been doing it for a very long time. Calvin Stone set his coffee cup down on the windowsill, very quietly, so no one would hear. He stood there in the cooling October evening of 1882, with the smell of cedar and cattle drifting in through the screen door, and he felt something shift inside his chest that had not moved in years. Something he had deliberately barricaded behind 14 years of hard work and deliberate solitude. He turned away from the kitchen before she could catch him watching. But he did not forget. He would never forget. It had begun 3 weeks before that evening, which meant it had begun at the end of September, when the Texas wind turned sharp at the edges, and the ranchers in Callahan County started thinking about putting up stores for the winter. Calvin had been in the town of Ridgeback, a modest but growing settlement 12 miles from his ranch, when he had encountered the notice on the board outside Hartley's Mercantile. He had stopped to read it only because Thomas Hartley had placed it beside a notice about a missing stallion, and Calvin had lost a stallion the previous spring and never fully recovered the frustration of it. The notice beside the stallion posting read, "Widow seeks domestic work. Experienced with cooking, mending, childcare, livestock feeding, and garden keeping. References available. Will work for room and board plus small wages for her 2 children. Inquire at the Morrison Boarding House, room 4. Calvin had read it twice. Then he had read it a 3rd time, not because he needed to, but because something in the spare, honest language of it had caught his attention in a way he could not immediately explain. There was no self-pity in those words, no embellishment, just a plain accounting of skills and a plain statement of need, and the fact that she had included her children in the wages, not herself. Just the children had lodged itself in his mind like a splinter he could not quite reach. He had turned away from the board and walked into Hartley's to purchase his supplies. He had told himself it was none of his concern. He had a housekeeper of sorts in old Marta Dillings, a woman from the next property who came twice a week to clean and left him meals that were technically edible if a man was not particular. He did not need a widow with 2 children complicating the orderly machinery of Stone Creek Ranch. He had lasted approximately 40 minutes before he found himself walking to the Morrison boarding house. He told himself it was practical. The ranch had empty rooms in the main house, since he had converted the bunkhouse for his 3 hands. He told himself it was the approaching winter, and the fact that Marta's knees were giving her trouble, and she had mentioned twice that she might not be able to make the cold weather ride. He told himself many logical, sensible things as he climbed the narrow stairs of the boarding house and knocked on the door of room 4. The woman who opened it was not what he had expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected. She was perhaps 28, though worry had added a quality to her eyes that made them seem older. She had dark brown hair pinned back with admirable practicality, and blue eyes that assessed him with a directness that was slightly startling in its confidence given her obvious circumstances. She was slender in a way that suggested not naturally slight, but rather insufficiently fed, and she held herself with a dignity that was almost aggressive in its composure, as though she were daring the world to pity her. Behind her, on the single narrow bed, a boy of about 6 sat reading a primer, and a little girl of perhaps 4 sat beside him looking at the pictures. Both children were clean. Both were decently, if carefully mended, in their clothes. The room itself was spotless despite being the size of a generous closet. "Mrs. Kendrick," Calvin had said. Yes, her voice was low and measured. "You are here about the notice." It was not a question. He had noted that immediately. She was not performing hope. She was simply gathering information. "Calvin Stone," he had said, extending his hand. "I run Stone Creek Ranch about 12 miles south. I have need of a capable housekeeper through the winter at minimum, possibly longer." She had shaken his hand with a firm, dry grip. "What are your terms?" he had told her. "Room and board for her and the children, a wage of $6 a month, 1 half-day free on Sundays." He had told her the work would be demanding because the ranch house was large and his 3 hands often took meals in the kitchen. He had told her she would have a room of her own, and the children could share the small adjacent room that had been his younger brother's before his brother had gone to Denver 6 years ago and not come back. She had listened to every word without interrupting, and when he finished she had said, "When do you need me to start?" "Monday would suit," he had said. "We will be there Sunday evening, if that is acceptable, so I can understand the kitchen before the workday begins." He had told her that was acceptable. He had tipped his hat and gone back down the stairs and walked to his wagon with a strange feeling in his chest that he was not ready to name. That had been 3 weeks ago. In those 3 weeks, Lavinia Kendrick had transformed Stone Creek Ranch's domestic situation with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had long since stopped waiting for things to be easy and simply made them work. The kitchen, which Calvin had navigated with minimal success since his wife Margaret had died 4 years ago, became a functioning, ordered place that produced 3 meals a day of genuine quality. The main house, which had accumulated the comfortable grime of a man living alone, revealed itself to have actual floors and actual windows once she had finished with it. His ranch hands, all 3 of them leather-faced and suspicious of change, had within a week begun timing their coffee breaks to coincide with whatever Lavinia happened to be baking. The children, Thomas and little Clara, had integrated into the rhythm of the ranch, with the resilience of children who have learned to adapt quickly, because staying in one place has not always been an option. Thomas had attached himself with quiet but unmistakable determination to Calvin's head hand, a Comanche Mexican man named Esteban Reyes who had worked Stone Creek for 7 years and who, to Calvin's private amusement, was utterly unprepared for the devotion of a 6-year-old boy. Clara, 4 years old and possessed of opinions well in excess of her years, had decided that the barn cats were hers and organized them accordingly. Calvin himself had maintained a careful, professional distance. He was a man who knew the difference between an employer and a man who allowed his household arrangements to become complicated, and he had no intention of allowing them to become complicated. He was 34 years old. He had been widowed for 4 years. He had made his peace with solitude, or at least he had constructed a functional version of it, and he did not intend to dismantle that construction. And then he had seen her not eat her supper. And then, 2 nights later, he had seen it again. And on the third occasion, when he watched her serve Thomas and Clara the last of the rabbit stew that had been intended for 4 people, Calvin Stone decided that he was going to have to do something about it, even if doing something about it meant breaching the careful professional distance he had worked very hard to maintain. He chose his moment carefully. It was a Tuesday morning, the children having walked with Esteban to inspect the cattle in the south pasture, a trip Thomas had been anticipating with the fervor usually reserved for Christmas, and the ranch hands were all out on the range. The kitchen was empty except for Lavinia, who was kneading bread dough with the focused, rhythmic intensity she brought to every physical task. Calvin poured himself a cup of coffee, leaned against the counter, and said, without preamble, "You are not eating." She did not stop kneading. "I beg your pardon. You are not eating your meals. You give your portions to the children and tell them it is extra." The kneading slowed for exactly 2 seconds. Then it resumed. "Mr. Stone, I assure you, I have watched it happen 3 times, he said. "I am not accusing you of anything. I am telling you that as the person responsible for the welfare of everyone on this ranch, I cannot allow it to continue." She turned then, and the expression on her face was something he had not anticipated. It was not embarrassment. It was not gratitude. It was something close to anger, and he realized suddenly that she was furious at having been seen. The hidden sacrifice exposed was a wound to her dignity. "My children's needs come before mine," she said, with a quietness that was more forceful than shouting would have been. "That is not something I intend to negotiate." "No one is asking you to," Calvin said carefully. "I am telling you that the food on this ranch is not rationed. There is sufficient for everyone, including you, 3 times a day. I am telling you that if the portions I provide are not adequate, you only need to say so." "The portions are more than adequate," she said, and he heard the fracture in it, the ghost of something that sounded like it might be relief but was too proud to complete itself. "Then eat them," he said simply. She held his gaze for a long moment. He had the sense of looking at a woman who had been holding a very heavy thing alone for a very long time and had forgotten that anyone else had hands. "Yes, sir," she said finally. He nodded once and took his coffee to the front porch, because if he stayed in that kitchen another minute, he was going to say something that crossed the professional line he had drawn and intended to keep. He sat on the porch steps in the bright October morning and listened to the cattle in the distance, and tried very hard not to think about the expression on her face when she had turned around. That combination of anger and relief and pride, and something underneath all of it that looked like it had been hungry for a very long time, not just for food. He drank his coffee and stared at the horizon, and told himself again that he was her employer and she was his employee, and the situation was perfectly clear. The situation, over the following days, became considerably less clear. Because Lavinia Kendrick was not a woman who could be easily categorized and then filed away, and Calvin Stone, despite himself, was a man who had always been drawn to things that resisted easy categorization. He learned, gradually and mostly by observation, because she volunteered very little, the outline of her history. Her husband, James Kendrick, had been a farmer in Kansas. He had died of pneumonia 18 months ago, in the spring of 1881, leaving behind 40 acres of mortgaged land, 2 children, and debts that had consumed whatever the land might have been worth. Lavinia had paid what debts she could with what money she had packed Thomas and Clara and what fit in 2 carpet bags, and had set out to make a different kind of life. She had worked her way south and west, spending several months in Abilene as a boarding house cook, then further south when the boarding house owner had made it clear that his interest in her extended beyond her cooking. She had arrived in Ridgeback 6 weeks before Calvin had found her notice, and she had been paying for the room at the Morrison with the last of her savings, which she had told Calvin with complete matter-of-factness when, in a moment of practical necessity, they had been discussing the household budget. He had given her the first month's wages in advance without making a point of it. He had also, without telling her, spoken to Esteban about quietly ensuring that the kitchen was stocked with the kind of food that encouraged a person of stubborn independence to serve themselves without having to explicitly ask for more. Esteban, who was considerably more perceptive than his weathered exterior suggested, had looked at Calvin for a long moment and then said, "The children are eating well, Mr. Stone," with an emphasis that indicated he had noticed the same thing Calvin had noticed, and Calvin had said good and walked away, and they had not discussed it again. But things changed after the kitchen confrontation. Not dramatically, not in a way that broke the careful architecture of their professional arrangement, but in a dozen small ways that accumulated. Lavinia began eating her own portions. She did not comment on it. She simply did it, with the same quiet composure she brought to everything, and Calvin did not comment on it either, but he noticed. She began, gradually, to stay in the kitchen a little later in the evenings after the children were in bed, working on mending, or on the household accounts she kept with meticulous, tiny handwriting in a ledger she had purchased with her own coin. Calvin often worked at the kitchen table in the evenings himself, going over the ranch accounts or writing correspondence to the cattle buyers in Fort Worth. They did not always speak during these evenings, but the silence between them shifted, over the weeks, from the silence of employer and employee to something warmer and less categorizable, a shared quiet that neither of them quite acknowledged. He learned she had been educated beyond what was common for a woman in her position. She had a quickness and precision with numbers that occasionally startled him, and once, when he had been working through a complicated calculation related to the cattle herd's feed costs over the winter, she had glanced at his figures without being asked, and pointed out an error in his multiplication with a brevity and accuracy that made him laugh, the first genuine laugh he had produced in longer than he cared to remember. She had looked at him when he laughed, with an expression he could not entirely read, something between surprise and something more unguarded. He learned she had a dry, very quiet sense of humor that emerged only occasionally, and only when she felt safe enough to let it. And each time it appeared it felt like an unexpected gift. He learned she read to the children every evening from whatever book was available, doing different voices for the characters with a commitment that made Clara shriek with delight, and made Thomas try very hard to look as though he was not equally delighted because he was 6 and therefore dignified. He learned that she woke before dawn every morning not because the work required it, but because she was the kind of person who needed a few minutes of unwitnessed quiet before the day began. And he began, without ever discussing it, to delay his own early morning coffee slightly so she could have the kitchen to herself for those minutes. November arrived and the temperature dropped, and the sky over the panhandle turned the color of pewter and stayed that way. The ranch settled into its winter rhythms, the hands spending more time near the outbuildings, the cattle requiring more attention as the grass thinned. Stone Creek Ranch was a prosperous operation by 1882 standards. Calvin ran 1,200 head of longhorn cattle, had good water rights on the creek that gave the place its name, and had a reputation among the Fort Worth buyers for delivering quality animals on time and as described. He was not wealthy in the Eastern sense, but he was secure, and the ranch was paid for, a fact he did not take for granted given how many of his neighbors were operating on bank debt and prairie optimism. He had no reason to be anything other than content. He was not content. He was, increasingly and inconveniently, something much more complicated than content. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday in the third week of November, riding in from the east in the form of a man named Garland Hooper. Garland Hooper was the kind of man the West produced in particular abundance in those years. Self-important, hungry for property he had not earned, and possessed of the specific arrogance that comes from having been told your whole life that the world owed you accommodation. He had a small spread 15 miles east of Ridgeback that he had acquired through means that the general community found suspicious, but had never been able to prove outright. And he had a wide-brimmed hat he wore at an angle that suggested he had formed his idea of himself from dime novels rather than actual experience. He rode into Stone Creek Ranch on a Wednesday morning and asked for Calvin, and Calvin received him on the porch with the polite but fundamentally unwelcoming hospitality of a man who has not invited someone to his property. Hooper's business, it emerged, was a proposition about water rights. He had a neighboring section of range that was drying out in the winter months, and he wanted access to Stone Creek for his cattle, and he was prepared to offer Calvin a cut of his calf sales in the spring as compensation. It was not an unreasonable proposition on its face, but there was something in the way Hooper presented it, a certainty that was too large, as though the negotiation had already been decided in a room Calvin had not been in, that made Calvin want to decline before he had fully heard the terms. He listened to the whole thing, asked 2 clarifying questions, and told Hooper he would think on it. Hooper accepted this with a smile that did not reach his eyes and turned his horse to leave, and then, as though the impulse had just occurred to him, turned back. "Your housekeeper," Hooper said. "Lavinia Kendrick." Calvin felt the specific cold that had nothing to do with November. "What about her?" "Known her a while," Hooper said pleasantly. "From when she was in Abilene. Fine woman. Difficult situation she was in." He paused, and the pause was deliberate and therefore meaningful. "James Kendrick owed me money when he died, you know. Died owing me a good sum. Never collected. Always felt that was an unresolved matter." Calvin looked at Hooper for a long, level moment. "The debt of a dead man passes with him," he said. "That is generally understood." "Legally, yes," Hooper agreed, still pleasant. "But morally, you know, there are different views. I have been patient. I am a patient man, Mr. Stone." He touched the brim of his hat. "Think on my offer. Good day." He rode off down the track, and Calvin stood on the porch and watched him go, and the cold feeling in his chest did not dissipate with the departure. He found Lavinia in the kitchen an hour later, preparing the midday meal, and he closed the kitchen door behind him, which was unusual enough that she turned from the stove with a look of immediate wariness. "Tell me about Garland Hooper," he said. The wariness sharpened into something harder. She turned back to the stove for a moment, the set of her shoulders telling him everything about what it cost her to compose herself before she spoke. "He was in Abilene when I was there," she said. He made his interest known, in an unpleasant fashion. "I left Abilene partly because of it." She paused. "James did owe him money, $30 from a failed land deal. James died before it was settled." "How long has Hooper been in Callahan County?" She turned around, and there was fear in her eyes that she was fighting very hard to manage. "About 3 months. I knew he had come south. I thought I had hoped the county was large enough." She stopped herself. "Is he making trouble?" "He made a business proposition," Calvin said carefully. He mentioned the debt in passing as though it were relevant to the proposition. It was a warning of some kind, though he was careful not to make it explicit. Lavinia's jaw tightened. "He will not stop," she said very quietly. "He is not a man who stops. In Abilene he told me that if I was willing to be amenable, the debt could be forgotten." The disgust in her voice was absolute. "I was not amenable." "No," Calvin said, "you would not be." Something in his voice made her look at him, and the look lasted a beat longer than was strictly necessary. "I will not bring trouble to your ranch," she said. "If he becomes a problem, you will stay," Calvin said with a firmness that surprised even himself. "This is your home. His visit changes nothing." She looked at him steadily for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove, and he thought he saw in the brief turn of her profile something that was not managed composure, something that was simply moved. "Thank you, Mr. Stone," she said. He nodded and walked back out to the yard and went to look for Esteban, because he was the kind of man who dealt with threats by understanding their full dimensions before he decided how to respond. And he wanted to know everything Esteban knew about Garland Hooper. which turned out to be more than Calvin had expected, and none of it was reassuring. Esteban had heard, from various sources in Ridgeback and beyond, that Hooper had left Abilene under a cloud related to some land documentation that had not borne scrutiny. He had heard that Hooper had a talent for finding women in difficult positions and using their vulnerability as leverage. He had heard that in at least one case in Abilene, a widow with children had been forced into a situation she had not chosen because Hooper had made her choices clear to her with the particular brutality of a man who understood exactly how desperate a woman alone could be made to feel. Calvin listened to all of this and then said, "Keep the hands close to the ranch for the next few days. I want someone in sight of the main road at all times." Esteban looked at him with the directness of a man who had worked beside him for 7 years and earned the right to it. "You going to do something about Hooper?" "I am going to be prepared," Calvin said. "There is a difference." He wrote a letter that same evening to the county sheriff in Baird, explaining in measured, factual language the visit he had received and the implied nature of Hooper's remarks. He was not a man who went to the law easily, but he was also not a man who underestimated the value of a paper trail. He sent it the next morning with his youngest hand, a 20-year-old from San Antonio named Pete, who rode fast and was reliable. Hooper's next move came faster than Calvin had expected. It came not in person but through a letter, delivered by a boy from town, addressed to Lavinia Kendrick, care of Stone Creek Ranch. Calvin brought it to her himself, and she opened it in the kitchen with the composed expression she used when she expected bad news. She read it, and then she read it again, and then she set it down on the table. "He says he has documentation that the debt was $35, not $30, she said. "He says the interest has accrued and it is now $60. He says he is prepared to take the matter to a court of law unless I settle it." She paused. "He says he is certain I understand that a court proceeding would bring unwanted attention to my situation." Calvin read the letter. It was clever. Not explicitly threatening, positioned as a legal matter, but the subtext was clear. Settle privately on his terms or face a proceeding that could be made complicated for a widow without resources. "He cannot enforce a dead man's personal debt against the widow," Calvin said. "Not under Texas law in 1882. He knows that. This is not a legal strategy, this is pressure." "I know what it is," Lavinia said. "Do you have $60? Calvin asked, not because he intended her to pay it but because he needed to understand her full situation. She looked at him steadily. "No." "Then we deal with it differently." He folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. "I have already written to the sheriff. I will write to my attorney in Abilene as well. Hooper is operating on the assumption that you have no one to stand behind you. We are going to disabuse him of that assumption." Lavinia was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she asked, and the question was not ungrateful but genuine. She genuinely wanted to understand his motive, because she had learned, presumably, that motives mattered and that apparent help sometimes had its own dark terms attached. Calvin thought about how to answer that. He thought about it with the honesty that the question deserved. "Because you are on my property and under my protection," he said. "And because you are a decent woman in a difficult position through no fault of your own, and Hooper is a bully who relies on decent people having no one to stand with them. I dislike bullies." He paused. "And because you deserve better than this." The last sentence was more personal than he had intended, and he saw her register it, a slight shift in her expression, something that went very careful and very still, like a person who has heard a sound they were not sure was real. "I will not be a burden to you," she said. "You are not," he said. "You are the best thing that has happened to this ranch in 4 years, and Thomas and Clara are the most life these walls have seen in longer than that. So stop looking for reasons to leave and let me handle Hooper." He said it more bluntly than he had planned, and he picked up his hat from the table and walked out before the conversation could continue into territory he had not prepared for. He stood in the yard for a moment in the November cold, breathing carefully, and felt the full weight of the truth he had just come very close to saying out loud. He was in love with her. He was in love with Lavinia Kendrick, who had arrived at his door 3.5 weeks ago with 2 children and 2 carpet bags, and the practiced competence of a woman who had learned to need no one, and who had not eaten her own supper so her children could have enough. He was in love with the way she read to Thomas and Clara at night. He was in love with her dry humor and her precise arithmetic and the expression on her face in the early morning before the day made demands of her, when she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked out at the range with something that was almost peace. He was in love with her dignity and her stubbornness, and the specific angry pride that rose in her when she felt seen in her vulnerability, and he was in love with the woman underneath all of that, who was tender and funny and tired and brave in a quiet, relentless way that he found almost unbearably admirable. He was in considerable trouble. He spent the next week dealing with Hooper through entirely practical channels. His attorney in Abilene, a sharp-minded man named Carver Hutchins, wrote back with confirmation of what Calvin had suspected. The debt, even if valid, had no legal enforceability against Lavinia. The letter Hooper had sent was designed to intimidate, not to win in court. Hutchins drafted a response that was devastating in its legal precision and sent it directly to Hooper. The sheriff in Baird, a methodical man named Wallace Reed, sent a deputy to speak with Hooper personally about the nature of harassment and the county's attitude toward it. Hooper went quiet. Not gone, Calvin was under no illusion that a man like Hooper simply gave up, but quiet for the moment, which was what Calvin needed. He kept the ranch hand rotation on the main road as a precaution. He told Lavinia that the immediate situation had been handled, but that she should tell him if she received any further communication from Hooper. She nodded, and in the nod there was something that had shifted, some wall that had come down perhaps half an inch. They began to talk more in the evenings, not about anything dramatic, about the ranch, the cattle, the children's progress. Thomas had taken to following Esteban with the devotion of a boy who needs a man to look up to, and had found one worthy of it. And Esteban, who had no children of his own and a wry affection he expressed primarily through teaching, had begun showing Thomas the basic principles of horsemanship in the afternoons. Clara, for her part, had formed an alliance with Pete the ranch hand that was based primarily on his willingness to dramatically overreact to whatever she showed him: a feather, a particularly round stone, the orange cat she had named General, and his obvious genuine delight in her company. One evening, Calvin came into the kitchen to find Thomas asleep in the chair by the stove with a book open on his chest, and Lavinia at the table mending one of the boys' shirts, her hair down from its practical daytime arrangement and loose around her shoulders. She looked up when he entered, and there was a moment of something in the lamplight, a moment of pure domestic intimacy that neither of them had quite arranged for and neither of them knew exactly what to do with. Calvin very carefully poured his coffee. He sat down at the other end of the table with his account ledger. They worked in silence for perhaps 20 minutes. Then Lavinia said quietly, "Tell me about your wife." He looked up. She was still mending, not looking at him, which told him that the question had cost her something to ask. "Margaret," he said. He thought about how to describe her. "She was brave," he said. She was from Missouri, came west with her parents when she was 16. She was not suited for the frontier in the way that some people are born suited for it, but she decided she would be, and she made herself that way by pure determination. We were married for 6 years. He paused. She died of fever. It was fast in the end. Lavinia said nothing, but she had stopped mending and she was listening. The ranch felt different afterward, Calvin said. Quieter than quiet, wrong kind of quiet. He looked down at his ledger. "I got good at not minding." "And then you stopped getting better at it," Lavinia said very softly. He looked at her. She was looking at her mending again. "Yes," he said. "I know what that is," she said. They did not say anything else for a while. But when Calvin looked up later, she was smiling at something in her own thoughts, a small private smile, and it was perhaps the most beautiful thing he had seen in a very long time. December arrived, and with it the particular splendor of a Texas panhandle winter, which was cold and clear and lit with a sky so enormous and so stars-thick that it made a person feel the precise extent of their smallness, which Calvin had always found more comforting than frightening. The ranch settled into its deepest cold-weather rhythms. The cattle required regular checking. The wood needed splitting and stacking. The days were short, and the evenings long in Stone Creek Ranch's kitchen, with its large iron stove and the lamp on the table and the smell of bread and coffee, became the living center of everything. On a Friday evening in the first week of December, Thomas came down with a bad cold that frightened both Lavinia and Calvin considerably more than it turned out to warrant, progressing to a mild fever for 2 nights before breaking cleanly on the third morning. During those 2 nights, Lavinia sat up beside his bed with the focused, frightened attentiveness of a mother who has already lost too much to be casual about loss. And Calvin, finding himself unable to sleep and unwilling to examine why, brought her coffee at midnight on both nights and sat with her in the small adjacent room. They talked, not about anything they were required to talk about, but about everything they actually cared about. About Kansas and about Texas, and about the particular quality of hope that drove people west when the Eastern life failed to hold them. About books they had read and things they believed, and what they wanted for their children and for themselves. About fear and about faith, and about the strange arithmetic of how a person counted their losses against their remainders and decided whether the sum was enough. On the second night, with Thomas breathing steadily and the lamp low, Lavinia said, "I came here afraid it would be another trap, that the offer would come with conditions I would discover only after I was dependent." "I know," Calvin said. "You knew I was afraid of that." "I could see it," he said, "in the way you watched for exits. In the way you never fully unpacked the first week. You had your bags ready in case you needed to leave quickly." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I noticed you noticed." "I tried to make it clear there were no conditions," he said. "I'm not sure I fully succeeded." "You did," she said. "Eventually, a pause. The day you confronted me about not eating, that was when I understood. Because I confronted you. Because of how you did it," she said. "You were angry not at me but at the situation, at the fact that it had happened at all. You were offended on my behalf." Her voice was careful and very steady. "No one had been offended on my behalf in a long time." Calvin Stone sat in the low lamplight beside a sleeping boy and felt the full magnitude of everything he was not yet saying. The weight of it was significant. The weight of the feeling he had been managing and labeling professional and keeping at careful distance was, in that quiet room, too large for its container. "Lavinia," he said. She looked at him. "I want to say something, and I want you to understand that there is no condition attached to it and no expectation of any particular response. Whatever you feel is the right answer will be the right answer." She nodded, and her eyes were very steady and very direct, and he thought again that she was one of the bravest people he had ever known. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for some time. I am telling you because I believe you deserve honesty, not because I expect anything of you." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Lavinia said, "You are very difficult to be logical about." He blinked. And then he laughed quietly so as not to wake Thomas, and she pressed her hand over her mouth to suppress her own laughter, and for a moment they were both quietly, helplessly amused, and the enormous weight of the declaration dispersed into something warmer. "Is that a good or bad thing?" He managed. "I have not decided," she said, but she was still smiling. "Ask me again in the morning." He did not ask her in the morning, because in the morning Thomas's fever broke and the household erupted into the joyful chaos of a sick child becoming suddenly, dramatically well, and there was broth to prepare and Clara to reassure and Esteban and the hands to inform, and the moment passed. But it had been said, and she knew. And in the days that followed, something changed in the space between them, not dramatically, not with speeches or gestures, but in the way she met his eyes now without the careful management she had always deployed before. In the way she smiled at him, sometimes across the kitchen for no particular reason. in the way she had stopped maintaining the half-step of professional distance and simply existed, sometimes, in the same space as him with the ease of a woman who had decided to stop being afraid of it. Hooper came back on a Tuesday. He came in person this time, and he did not come alone. He brought with him a man named Decker, who worked for him in various capacities, and who had the specific build of someone hired primarily to make a room feel dangerous. They rode in just after noon when Esteban and two of the hands were in the east pasture, and only Pete was near the barn. Calvin was at the corral fence and turned when he heard the hoofbeats. He stood very still and watched Hooper ride in, and he felt the cold calculation of a man who has been patient and has now run out of patience. "Stone," Hooper said, reining in. He did not dismount, which was a statement in itself. "Your lawyer friend sent me a very unfriendly letter." "That was the intention," Calvin said. "I am a reasonable man," Hooper said. "I have a reasonable proposition. The Kendrick widow owes me money. You clearly have an interest in her welfare." The smile was unpleasant. "I am willing to resolve the whole matter if you are willing to facilitate a straightforward business arrangement." "Between whom?" Calvin said. "Between you and me," Hooper said. "The water rights I mentioned. Access to your creek, full season, in exchange for my dropping all claims against the widow." "She has no valid claims against her," Calvin said. "My attorney made that clear." "Courts are slow and uncertain things," Hooper said pleasantly. "And a woman with 2 children and limited resources finds them particularly inconvenient, don't you think? Even a case that fails can ruin a person's peace for a year or two while it works through the system." The threat was explicit now. Calvin looked at Decker, who was sitting slightly behind and to the right, and then back at Hooper. "You are going to leave this property," Calvin said. "You are going to leave it now, and you are not going to return. You are going to withdraw any and all claims or implied claims against Mrs. Kendrick, in writing, delivered to my attorney in Abilene within the week. And you are going to understand that I have a letter at the sheriff's office in Baird detailing this conversation and your previous visit, and that if anything happens to anyone on this ranch, or if Mrs. Kendrick is harassed in any way, the first person Sheriff Reed comes to see will be you." There was a silence. Decker shifted in his saddle, not threatening exactly but present. Calvin did not move. He had been still through the whole conversation, absolutely still, the specific stillness of a man who is not afraid and is making sure that is understood. Hooper looked at him for a long moment. "You would make a lot of trouble over a widow woman," he said. "Yes," Calvin said simply. "I would." Something in the simplicity of it seemed to register. Hooper looked at him with the assessing calculation of a bully recalibrating, weighing the potential cost against the potential gain, and finding the balance had shifted. "You'll regret getting in the middle of this," Hooper said. "You'll regret not leaving when you were asked," Calvin replied. Pete had appeared in the barn doorway behind them, and though Pete was 20 and lean, he had a lever-action rifle at a comfortable angle that communicated clearly without being theatrical about it. Hooper turned his horse. Decker followed. They rode out without speaking again. Calvin stood at the fence until they were out of sight, and then he turned and found Lavinia standing on the porch steps. She had seen all of it. She walked toward him across the yard, and he stood and waited, and when she reached him she stopped about 2 feet away and looked at him with an expression that was unguarded in a way he had never quite seen from her before. "Thank you," she said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. I want to say it clearly without managing it or qualifying it." Her eyes were bright and very direct. "Thank you for standing between me and that, for not having a price, for not being what I was afraid you would be when I came here." "I'm just a man trying to do the decent thing," Calvin said. "You are considerably more than that," she said, "and I think you know it." They stood in the cold December yard, 12 miles from the town of Ridgeback, under a Texas sky that went on forever in every direction, and Calvin Stone said, "I asked you to answer me in the morning, and then the moment passed." "I remember," she said. "I am asking again now." Lavinia looked at him steadily, with all her composure and all her directness and all the brave, practical, tender realness of her, and said, "I believe I have been in love with you since the morning you told me to eat my supper, and I was furious at you for it because I could feel that it was genuine, and I had forgotten what genuine felt like, and it terrified me." He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood like that in the yard for a moment, both of them aware of having arrived somewhere neither of them had expected, and both of them finding it to be exactly right. "There are complications," she said, practically. "There are," he agreed. "There are two small, wonderful complications, and I would not have it otherwise." She looked at him searchingly. "Thomas and Clara need a home," he said, "a stable one, with people who are going to stay." He paused because the next thing needed to be clear. "I am not speaking lightly, Lavinia. I am speaking about marriage if you are willing to consider it, not as a solution to a practical problem. Because I love you and I want you to be my wife, and I want Thomas and Clara to know this ranch as their home for the rest of their lives." The brightness in her eyes was not quite managed now. "That is a very direct proposal," she said. "I am a direct man." "You are," she said. She squeezed his hand. "Yes." He looked at her. "Yes. Yes, Calvin, I will marry you." He brought her hand to his lips and pressed them against her knuckles, formal and genuine all at once, and she laughed a little at the formality, and he smiled against her hand, and it was perhaps the most right thing he had ever felt. They told the children that evening after supper. Thomas listened with serious, careful attention, his eyes moving between Calvin and his mother, doing the arithmetic of it. Clara listened for approximately 15 seconds and then launched herself at Calvin with the full physical confidence of a 4-year-old who had already decided she liked him months ago and therefore this was simply official. Thomas, after a moment, said, "Does that mean I can learn to rope cattle?" "Yes," Calvin said, "and Esteban will teach me." "Esteban has already been informed," Calvin said, which was not quite true yet but would be within the hour. Thomas appeared to find this satisfactory. He went back to his book. But a few minutes later, when Calvin passed the boy's chair, Thomas reached out and briefly gripped Calvin's hand with both of his, small and serious and trusting, and did not say anything. And Calvin stood very still for a moment and felt something that needed time to fully absorb settle into him like good rain into dry ground. Hooper's written retraction arrived at Carver Hutchins's office in Abilene 11 days later, 2 days before the deadline Calvin had set. It was brief and ungracious, but it was explicit. All claims, legal and personal, against Lavinia Kendrick were withdrawn. Hutchins wrote to confirm its receipt and its legal adequacy. Calvin read the letter aloud to Lavinia in the kitchen, and she sat with her hands folded on the table, and when he finished, she simply said, "Good," with a finality that closed the matter entirely. They were married in Ridgeback on the 15th of December, 1882, in the small whitewashed church on the main street, in the presence of Esteban Reyes and Pete and the other 2 ranch hands, whose names were Frank and Sam, and the Reverend Aldous Marsh, who performed the ceremony with a warmth that suggested he had seen many marriages and could tell when 2 people were arriving at the altar, because it was exactly right. Thomas stood beside Calvin and Clara stood beside her mother, and when the Reverend spoke the words and Calvin and Lavinia exchanged their promises, both children were, for once, completely still. Calvin put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band he had bought from Hartley's Mercantile 2 days before, chosen with the care of a man who understood that simplicity, chosen well, was its own kind of richness. And when the Reverend said he could kiss his bride, he cupped her face in both hands with a gentleness that made her eyes fill, and kissed her softly in the winter light of the small church, and felt the whole weight of everything that had led to this moment. The grief and the solitude and the chance glance across a kitchen table at a woman not eating her supper resolve itself into something that was simply, irreducibly good. They drove back to Stone Creek Ranch in the wagon in the late afternoon, Thomas asleep against Calvin's arm within 20 minutes of departure, Clara asleep in Lavinia's lap, the sky above the panhandle turning the deep orange rose of a December sunset, the kind of sky that made the whole world look like it had been lit for a purpose. "Are you happy?" Lavinia asked quietly, so as not to wake the children. He looked at her in the last of the sunset light, with Thomas's sleeping weight against his side and the ranch ahead of them and the ring on her finger catching the orange glow, and he said, "I did not think I was going to be again. I had made a fair peace with that." He paused. "I was wrong." She leaned her head against his shoulder, carefully, so Clara would not be disturbed, and he adjusted his arm around her, and they drove the last miles to the ranch in the dark that came after the sunset, the kind of dark that felt safe rather than empty, with the horses knowing the road and the stars coming out above the panhandle in their uncountable thousands. The winter months of 1883 settled over Stone Creek Ranch with the particular beauty of a place that has found its right shape. The work continued, because on a cattle ranch the work always continues, but it continued now with a different quality. Calvin moved through his days with the awareness of a man who has something to come home to, and Lavinia moved through hers with the settled confidence of a woman who has stopped waiting for the ground to shift beneath her. They had their first real argument in January, over the kitchen accounts, specifically over Lavinia's habit of finding unnecessary economies in areas where Calvin believed there was no need to economize. She maintained that good management required constant vigilance regardless of current prosperity. He maintained that good management did not require his wife to choose between the adequate coffee and the better coffee when they could afford both. The argument was brief and heated, and ended with both of them laughing at the specific smallness of what they were arguing about. And afterward she bought the better coffee, and he acknowledged that she was probably right about the vigilance in general, and they were both quietly pleased about the whole thing. In February, Calvin began formally teaching Thomas the basics of ranching: how to read cattle for health signs, how to understand the seasonal rhythms of the range, how to work with and beside the horses rather than simply directing them. Thomas was 7 in February, old enough to absorb things seriously, and he absorbed them with a seriousness that both Calvin and Lavinia found moving, a boy claiming a future with both hands. Clara continued her sovereign reign over the barn cats, and had by February expanded her jurisdiction to include the chickens, whom she addressed by name, and whom she expected to respond to those names with a consistency the chickens were not always able to provide. She had also begun attaching herself to Lavinia's kitchen work with the specific intensity of a child who has decided she is going to know how everything is done, and Lavinia taught her with patient and genuine pleasure. In March, Lavinia told Calvin, on a quiet Sunday morning while they sat on the porch in the mild early spring sun, that she was expecting a child. He looked at her for a moment, and the expression on his face was one she would describe later to herself, as something that made her understand what it meant to be loved by a person who had genuine capacity for joy. He took her hand and pressed it between both of his and said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I have been well for months. Is there anything you need?" "I need you to stop looking at me like that," she said, "because I am going to cry and I would prefer not to." He smiled and brought her hand to his lips, and she looked out at the range in the spring morning, at the grass coming green along the creek and the cattle moving easy in the distance, and felt the specific deep contentment of a life that had been very difficult and was now, unambiguously, something else. The news was received by Thomas with the gravity appropriate to a senior member of the household who understood his position would be affected. He thought about it for a full day and then announced to Calvin that he was prepared to accept the situation. Calvin thanked him with equal gravity and a great effort to conceal his amusement. Clara announced that she wanted a brother, and when Lavinia asked why, she said it was because she already had a Thomas and a Thomas was sufficient, and a second Thomas would be too much, which was such unanswerable logic that no one attempted to address it. Spring ran into summer on the ranch and summer was full and good. The cattle herd had its best calving season in years. The range was well watered by a reasonably generous spring, and Stone Creek Ranch turned a profit in the summer cattle sale that allowed Calvin to make two improvements he had been planning for years: a proper root cellar for the main house and a new well closer to the barn. Lavinia supervised the root cellar construction with the enthusiasm of a woman who had spent years managing food scarcity and now intended to manage food abundance with equal thoroughness. The hands found this deeply entertaining and participated willingly. Esteban, that summer, did something that surprised everyone by courting and eventually marrying a woman named Rosa from a family in Ridgeback who ran the town's small bakery. She was 31 and direct and funny, and she and Lavinia became friends with the easy swiftness of two people who recognize in each other the specific kind of competence they themselves possess. Rosa began spending Sundays at Stone Creek, which meant Sunday dinners became genuinely extraordinary events, and Thomas attached himself to Rosa with the same instinctive trust he gave to Esteban, and Clara demanded Rosa teach her to make empanadas, and the entire arrangement felt less like an addition to the household and more like something that had always been meant to be there. In August, Frank and Sam, the two remaining hands who had been at Stone Creek since before Calvin had been widowed, came to him separately within a week of each other and told him, with a great deal of roundabout preamble, that they were glad things had worked out with Mrs. Stone. Calvin shook both their hands and said he was glad of it too, and the conversations were brief and uncomfortable for everyone involved and meant everything. The baby came in November, 1 year after Lavinia had first arrived at Stone Creek Ranch. He came on a cold, clear night with a full moon over the panhandle, and he came into the world with the vocal confidence of someone who had decided to make his presence known without delay. The doctor from Ridgeback had made it in good time, and Rosa was there, and Esteban paced the porch with Calvin while the night was long and then was over. And when the doctor opened the door and said that mother and child were both well and healthy, Calvin went inside and found Lavinia in the lamplight with a dark-haired, round-faced boy in her arms, looking at Calvin with an expression that contained everything the year had been. He sat beside her on the bed and looked at his son and felt the quiet magnitude of it. "What shall we call him?" she asked. He thought about it. "James," he said, looking at her carefully, "if you are willing, after your first husband." He was Thomas and Clara's father, and they should not lose that. She looked at him for a long, full moment, and what was in her eyes was something beyond what ordinary words were built to contain. "James Calvin Stone," she said. "That is a considerable name for a person this size," he observed. "He will grow into it," she said. Thomas, brought in to see his new brother, examined the baby with the analytical composure of a 7-year-old and declared him acceptable. Clara looked at the baby, looked at Lavinia, looked at Calvin, and said, "He is very loud," with a tone that suggested she was reserving judgment. Then she asked if she could hold him, and when she did, she went utterly silent and still, and the expression on her face was the expression of a person who has encountered something that reorganizes what they previously understood about the world. The first year of marriage gave way to the second with the ease of a life that had found its right rhythm. Calvin and Lavinia's story, as the people of Ridgeback knew it, and they knew it the way small communities in 1883 know everything, through the specific sieve of observation and inference, and the occasional reliable account, was told most often in the version that Esteban gave to anyone who asked him, which was a version of admirable brevity. Stone noticed she needed looking after, and he looked after her, and then they fell in love, which was the right order for two people like that. What Esteban left out, because he was a man of economy, was the specific moment that had started everything. The evening in October 1882, when a rancher had stood in his kitchen doorway and watched a woman quietly give her supper to her children and call it extra, and had felt the truth of it hit him like something physical. Had watched the practiced ease of her sacrifice and understood that it was not occasional but habitual, not recent but deeply formed, and had made a silent decision in that moment that he would never fully articulate but would never, for the rest of his life, stop acting on. He had never told Lavinia precisely that that was the moment. He told her the confrontation about the supper was when he began to understand what he felt, but he never told her he had seen it first, the sacrifice itself, the quiet and complete way she had put her children's hunger before her own. He told her in the spring of 1884, on an evening when James was 5 months old and sitting in Lavinia's lap on the porch, while Thomas and Clara ran wild in the long grass along the creek in the evening light, and the ranch was everything Calvin had ever hoped it might be when he was a young man digging the first fence post into Texas dirt. "There is something I have not told you," he said. She looked at him with the directness she had always given him, the complete and unmanaged attention that was one of the things he loved most about her. He told her about the evening in October, the kitchen doorway, the plate she had said was extra. She was quiet for a while. "You saw that," she said. "Yes. How long before you spoke to me about it?" "3 more times," he said. "I watched it happen 3 times before I said anything." She looked out at the creek, where Thomas was teaching Clara something that seemed to involve a great deal of running, with James making interested noises on her lap. "I was so ashamed when you confronted me," she said. "Not of feeding them, never of that. But of being seen in the need of it, of being known for that." "I know," he said. "That is why I tried to be careful. Were you not?" She said it not quite as an accusation and not quite as fondness, something between the two which was a register that was very particular to them. "You were direct and slightly terrifying." "That is my natural condition," he said. She laughed, and James, startled by the laugh, made a sound of his own and then beamed at nothing in particular with the universal good humor of a healthy 5-month-old. And Calvin reached over and settled his hand against the boy's back, warm and small and solid. "I am glad you saw it," Lavinia said, after a moment. "I am glad you could not look away from it, even if it was painful." She paused. It was the first time in a very long time that someone saw the real situation and did not look away. "I would not," he said. "I would never." She leaned her head against his shoulder, James between them, and they watched Thomas and Clara in the last of the evening light. The grass along the creek was green and long. The sky was doing what Texas skies did at the end of the day, which was to burn with a color that had no accurate name and last longer than you expected, and then gradually, gracefully, become stars. "I have a thought," Lavinia said. "Tell me. We should build a schoolroom." He looked at her. "On the ranch. There are 6 children within 5 miles of here who have no school to attend. Thomas is 7 and doing his reading and arithmetic from what I can teach him, which is sufficient for now, but will not be for long. Rosa and Esteban are going to have children. Pete is showing every sign of settling if he can find the courage to speak to the Hartley girl, in which case there will be children." She had the energized precision she always had when she had been thinking a project through. "If we build a schoolroom on the south end of the house and write to the state board about a teacher, or if I take the certification myself, which I believe I could manage with the right preparation." "Do both," Calvin said. She looked at him. "Build the schoolroom and get the certification," he said. "We have the resources. The schoolroom is a sound idea. You teaching is a sound idea. There is no reason to choose." She was quiet for a moment, and he recognized the quality of the quiet, the specific silence of a woman who has spent years managing scarcity and is still, sometimes, startled by the fact of sufficiency. "Yes," she said. "All right, both." He kissed her temple, and she turned and kissed him properly, and James made a sound of complaint at being momentarily unattended, which was so exactly timed that they both laughed, and the evening continued, and the stars came out above the Texas panhandle in their full and extravagant numbers, and Stone Creek Ranch held all of them, living and loved and rooted. The schoolroom was built by September of 1884, a clean and practical room on the south end of the main house, with 2 windows for light, and a proper blackboard that Calvin ordered from Fort Worth, and that arrived in September looking more official than anything else on the ranch, which deeply impressed Thomas and caused Clara to immediately attempt to draw on it, which was technically within the spirit of the thing if not quite the letter. Lavinia passed the state certification examination for schoolteachers in November of 1884, scoring in the upper portion of the range, which she accepted with composure, and Calvin celebrated with more visible enthusiasm than she felt the occasion strictly warranted, though privately she was pleased by both the score and his reaction. She opened the Stone Creek School on the first Monday of January 1885, with 8 students. Thomas, Clara, and James Stone, the 2 children of a farming family named the Caldwells from 2 miles north, the daughter of the Mexican family who worked the section east of the ranch, a 9-year-old boy named Willie from a homestead to the west, whose mother had asked Lavinia about it with a hopefulness that had been impossible to refuse, and the first child of Esteban and Rosa, a fierce and delightful 2-year-old named Lucia, who was technically too young for formal instruction, but who attended every day because Rosa brought her along and she had firmly decided to be there. Calvin rode past the schoolroom window on the first morning of school and heard through the glass Lavinia's voice, clear and measured and warm, asking Thomas to read the first paragraph of the passage she had set, and Thomas's voice, serious and careful, reading it, and Clara asking a question that interrupted before he had finished, and Lavinia managing this with a patience that was simultaneously absolute and slightly amused. He sat on his horse in the January morning, and listened for a moment he had not earned and did not announce, and he thought about a woman in a kitchen doorway in Ridgeback, and a notice on a board outside Hartley's Mercantile, and a plate of food served to children by hands that had trembled slightly, and all the distance between that October evening in 1882 and this January morning in 1885, which was not very far in miles or years, but was incalculably large in everything that mattered. He rode on to the south pasture, where the cattle were grazing in the winter sun, and the creek ran clear beside the range, and the sky was the full enormous blue that you only got in a Texas winter when the air was cold and sharp and completely honest about what it was. Spring arrived again, and summer again, and the ranch grew and the school grew, and Thomas turned 10 with the gravity appropriate to a decade of existence, and Clara turned 8 with the refusal to be impressed by gravity that was her particular gift. James turned 2 and developed strong opinions about everything, which Calvin found both exhausting and absolutely familiar, since the opinion development appeared to have come from his mother. The school had 12 students by the autumn of 1885, and Lavinia had written to the state board requesting a formal designation, which they provided in December, making Stone Creek School an officially recognized institution, a fact that appeared in the Ridgeback Gazette with a brief notice that called Mrs. Calvin Stone's achievement a fine example of frontier initiative, which was accurate and also approximately 1/10 of what it actually was. In the winter of 1885, Lavinia told Calvin she was expecting again. He held her in the kitchen in the early morning when the children were still sleeping, in the kitchen that had been the beginning of everything, and she rested her head against his chest, and they stood there for a long, quiet moment with the stove warm behind them and the stars still visible through the window. "Are you happy?" she asked him, which was what she always asked. He thought about the honest answer, as he always did, because she had always deserved honesty from him and always would. "I am the happiest I know how to be," he said, "and I suspect I am still learning how to be happier." She tilted her head back and looked at him with those direct, steady eyes, and smiled with the full particular warmth that was his and no one else's. "That," she said, "is the right answer." The second child, a boy again, arrived in July of 1886, dark-haired and loud and entirely himself from the first moment, and they named him William after Calvin's father, who had been dead for 12 years, and who Calvin thought would have found a great deal to approve of in all of this. William turned out to have Clara's constitution for opinion and Thomas's constitution for gravity, resulting in a personality that was simultaneously very certain and very serious about its certainty, which the household found endlessly entertaining. Thomas, at 12, was already helping Calvin with real ranch work, not the symbolic participation of childhood but genuine labor, riding fence lines, and helping move cattle and learning to read the range and the weather the way his father had taught him, with patience, and with the understanding that the land was not to be conquered but understood. He called Calvin father, which he had begun doing of his own decision at the age of 8, one morning at breakfast, with no announcement or preamble, and Calvin had received it with his coffee cup exactly halfway to his mouth and had set it down and cleared his throat once and said, "Good morning, Thomas." And that had been the whole transaction, and it was everything. Clara, 10, was preparing to be a person of considerable capacity and inconvenient brilliance, and both her parents knew it and were making sure she had every resource to fulfill it. She had a particular aptitude for mathematics and natural science that Lavinia was already thinking about in terms of future education, and she had a directness that reminded Calvin, in moments of illuminating honesty, very specifically of her mother. The ranch continued to prosper. Calvin and Esteban, partners in all but formal paperwork, had expanded the herd and taken on 2 additional hands, bringing Stone Creek Ranch to a scale that required real management and produced real returns. The creek that gave the place its name continued to run clear through the seasons, a dependable miracle in a region where water was the first and final currency of survival. In the autumn of 1887, on an October evening that was cool and clear in the way of all the October evenings that had meant so much at Stone Creek, Calvin and Lavinia sat on the porch after the children were in bed. James was nearly 4 and sleeping with the total commitment of a very small person who has exhausted every resource. William was 14 months and doing the same. The older children, Thomas at 13 and Clara at 11, were reading. The ranch was quiet in the good way. The specific quiet of a place that is full of things and people and is, for the moment, at rest. "Do you remember the night I told you I was in love with you?" Calvin asked. "In Thomas's room," Lavinia said. "During his fever. You told me you had been in love with me since I told you to eat your supper, and I was furious about it," she confirmed, with the dry amusement that had been one of his greatest pleasures for 5 years. "You were terrifying," he said, in a remarkable way. She turned and looked at him with the evening between them. "I was so afraid," she said. "Not of you specifically, of what it meant to feel that, to want something again and have to risk the wanting." "I know," he said. "I was afraid of it too. You did not show it." "I showed it," he said. "You just missed it because you were managing your own." She considered this. "Perhaps," she allowed. He reached for her hand across the space between the porch chairs, and she gave it to him, and they sat with the October sky above the panhandle, enormous and starthic and lit with the particular clarity of a cold, clear night. "I have been thinking," Lavinia said. "That is generally how trouble starts," he said. "The school needs a proper building," she said. "Not the room on the house, a dedicated schoolhouse. The state board would provide more support if there were a proper structure. We could serve 20 children easily, maybe more." He thought about it. "Where?" "There is that flat section near the road," she said. "Would be accessible without people coming all the way to the ranch house. A proper door, proper windows, a stove of its own." "In the spring," he said. "We build it in the spring." "You agree that easily." "It is a good idea," he said. "Your ideas are generally good ideas. I have learned to agree with them at the front end rather than the back end, where agreement costs more." She looked at him with that particular smile. "You are a practical man." "I am," he said. "It is among my better qualities." "It is," she said. She leaned her head back against her chair and looked at the stars. "Calvin, I am glad you noticed me." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about all the things that were contained in that sentence. All the years and the children and the school and the ring on her finger and the boys asleep inside, and Thomas reading and Clara doing complicated sums for her own entertainment and Esteban and Rosa at their own house on the east of the ranch, and the cattle grazing along the creek in the dark. "I am glad I was in the right doorway at the right moment," he said. "It was not the right doorway," she said. "It was an ordinary kitchen doorway. You were just paying attention." "I was paying attention to you," he said. "That was the difference." She turned and looked at him, and it was the same look she had given him in 100 different kitchens and bedrooms and porches and pastures, the look that was still, 5 years later, the best thing he had ever been the recipient of, unguarded and direct and entirely, completely his. "Yes," she said quietly, "that was the difference." He brought her hand to his lips and held it there for a moment, and the stars kept on above the Texas panhandle in their ancient and uncountable arrangement, and the ranch kept on around them, steady and real and rooted, and Stone Creek continued to run clear through the dark, as it had before either of them arrived, and as it would long after, carrying with it the quiet fact of everything that had happened here, the sacrifices and the noticing of them, the truths said in the middle of the night, and the answers given with composure, and then without it. The children who had arrived with 2 carpet bags and had grown up with their boots in Texas soil. The meals, all the meals, every one of them now enough. The man who had noticed. The woman who had let herself be noticed. The life that had been built from that beginning, which was not grand or dramatic in the way of stories, but which was real in the way of everything that matters, solid and warm and daily and enduring, and which would continue to be so for all the long years that still lay ahead of them, stretching out like the Texas range itself, wide open and full of light.